Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for September the 22nd, 2021. I hope you're having a great day so far. And we got some interesting texts for us today. So why don't we jump right on in? We've got 2 Samuel 18. We've got 2 Corinthians 11, then Ezekiel Chapter 25, and then Psalm 73. Why don't we start out with 2 Samuel 18? So we're continuing the story of David and this, what we would call the succession, what some scholars call the succession narrative, this narrative of how David is ultimately losing power and is losing control of his kingdom. And of course, this is seen in the many hardships that David experiences and heartbreaks, the disorder that he sees in his kingdom. We talked about on Sunday the unity that he prays for, and he talks about how brothers dwell in unity is something that's good and pleasant. Well, we're not seeing that here because we're seeing the rebellion of his son Absalom. So David's forces and Absalom's forces end up fighting one another. Remember, Absalom had received some bad advice from one of David's advisors that he had planted in Absalom's sphere of influence, I guess you could say. And then, so Absalom's trying to seize the full control of Israel and Judah, but he's got to try to kill his father in order to do so. But David strategically moves in this battle to a site that more fits the strength of his army. And ultimately, David wins out. David's forces win out. Famously, Absalom ends up getting stuck in a tree, and Joab comes over and has him killed. The question then is, who's going to go tell David of this news? And again, we have this kind of, you've probably seen this throughout the books of Samuel. We've had several occasions where, people who think this is going to be good news, it ends up being bad news in terms of how David perceives of it. And this is another one of those cases. And there's a man named Ahimaaz that wants to go and tell David. And instead, Joab appoints a Cushite to go and do so. So they're running, and Ahimaaz actually overtakes him. And so he gets there first, and David asks him, well, because he wanted to tell him about the victory in the battle. And Ahimaaz says, well, yeah, we had this great victory. And then David asks him about his son, and he says, well, I didn't really see that. And then finally, this other guy comes up and says the same thing, except he says that your son Absalom had been killed, and this causes David obviously great grief. One of my favorite singers is a guy named Pierce Pettis. He's a folk singer. Love Pierce Pettis. He's somewhat retired now. He's been singing for a long time in his life. I love him because he has some really deep lyrics. He has some Christian themes in it, not necessarily who I would call a Christian singer, but he has very much some powerful reflections on just life and living life. So if you enjoy folk music, Pierce Pettis is a great one to look up. But he's got a great song that's about this story about Absalom. And one of the lines in his song goes something like, Absalom, Absalom, even as David says at the end of this chapter, my son, caught in the tangles of your hair, fruit of my own sins to bear. Oh, Absalom, and he is grieving there. But what I love about what Pierce Pettis picks up there is indeed what David, I think, is realizing in this text is that what he brought into his kingdom, the disorder he brought into his kingdom through his sin, is bearing fruit now with his son Absalom and his rebellion and his ultimate death. And again, this all plays into the storyline of Scripture by showing something of a prophetic picture of what would happen ultimately to Israel, failing because of the failures of the Davidic kings, and also looking forward ultimately to that king who would not fail. So 2 Samuel 18. That brings us to, let's go over to Psalm 73. So Psalm 73 is a psalm that is beginning the next book of Psalms. In fact, you probably have book 3 above Psalm 73. This will carry on through, I believe it's Psalm 89, I think. Let me just make sure that I'm telling you right there. And so book 3 is a shorter book of Psalms, but again, the purpose of all these is to mirror, Psalm 89, is to mirror the structure of the Pentateuch itself, telling us something about what the Psalms were supposed to do, and that is to, just like the Pentateuch was Torah or instruction on who God is and who we are and how we're to relate to him, exhortation, Psalms that exhort our hearts and give us instruction on how to live in covenant relationship with God. Just like the Torah was supposed to do that, so also the Psalms are doing that. As we've talked about in our sermon series all summer, we've talked about how the Psalms mold and shape our hearts. And Psalm 73 is definitely one that does this. This is more of a wisdom psalm. By the way, this is also a psalm of Asaph. And so for the next 11 Psalms, Psalm 73 through 83, we will have Psalms of Asaph. Asaph was a member of David's royal court. He was one who was appointed by David in the book of Chronicles as to the one who would lead the music as they would bring the Ark of the Covenant back in, and he would be the leader over the temple singers. And so he's one definitely associated with not only David, but also singing within the context of worship. By the way, Psalm 50 is also a psalm of Asaph. Probably these at least these 11 were part of a collection that existed before they were brought into the book of Psalms. But again, this is a psalm of wisdom, and so it reflects upon those wisdom themes of two ways, two choices, the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked, especially in this text. And the psalmist is reflecting on how the wicked seem to be prospering. Verse 3, I saw the prosperity of the wicked. To the extent that he's even saying in verse 13, surely in vain I've kept my heart pure. It's almost a Job-like appeal, isn't it, here, where he's saying, why have I done all these things? Bad things are happening to me. But by the end of the psalm, we have him restored to his faith and confidence in God. One of the most beautiful and well-known verses is verse 25, which was actually made into a worship song. Whom have I in heaven but you? And besides you, I desire nothing on the earth. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is my strength and my heart and my portion forever. So he has it restored at the end, even as we see in many of these psalms where the struggle happens in the middle of the psalm, but by the end, the psalmist has his confidence restored. So that's Psalm 73. Over to Ezekiel chapter 25. So we're moving into a different section of Ezekiel. I previewed this yesterday, where we have in Ezekiel 25 through Ezekiel 33, we have texts that deal with not Ezekiel 33, Ezekiel 32, which deal with God's judgment on the nations surrounding Israel. Ezekiel 33 will be one final judgment oracle, and then we'll get to finally in Ezekiel 34 through 48, which will be all salvation oracles. So it's a very, very purposeful structure on the part of Ezekiel. We've already seen in chapters 1 through 24, the decline of Israel, the judgment that's coming upon Judah in the Babylonian exile. But now we see and read of God's judgment on these nations. And as it has the same feel that we have in some of the other judgment oracles against the nations that we saw in Isaiah and Jeremiah. And we see another theme that I think we've seen already in the book of Ezekiel, where God is doing something to establish his name. We'll see this theme again later on in chapter 36 of Ezekiel as it refers to Judah. But in this case, God does this judgment against these nations because of what they have done to Israel. Whether it's Moab or Ammon or Edom, Philistia, all had longstanding enmity towards Israel. Some of them, including especially Edom, as we saw with Jeremiah and with Isaiah. We'll see it again with the book of Obadiah. Edom receives particular ire because they are ones who not only participated in perhaps the exile of the Jewish people, but also applauded it and were enthusiastic about it. And so the Edomites have a special vengeance coming from God. And these, of course, are meant to bring comfort to God's people as they go through this difficult time in their life as a nation. Probably to those who are already in exile. But what my eyes are drawn to is what I referred to earlier, is that that which is the motivation for God's actions, apart from their treatment of God's people. But he does these things that they may know that I am the Lord. So three times over in the text, in verse 7, verse 11, and verse 17, Ezekiel describes these things as being done so that they might know that I am the Lord. And of course, that's what we see, for instance, all the way back in the Exodus, where we have those plagues, and the reason for the plagues against that foreign nation at the time, Egypt, was for the purpose of knowing the Egyptians and the Israelites knowing that God is the Lord. And what is his identity? Who is the Lord? He is the covenant God of Israel, who brought Israel into existence, and he will restore Israel. So this is to establish his identity. So yes, the Israelites or the Jewish people here will benefit from these judgments against the foreign nations, but ultimately God does it for his own sake, for his own glory. So Ezekiel 25. That brings us finally to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. So this is continuing Paul's defense of his own apostleship. And he begins in 2 Corinthians 11. Really, this whole chapter is devoted to that, defending his apostleship. This is something that started back in chapter 10 as well. Paul defends himself against these opponents. He kind of sarcastically calls them super apostles in verse 5. But he compares them to those who would deceive others. He even compares them to the serpent who deceived Eve. They are false prophets and deceitful workers, verse 13, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ, even as Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So they attest to be bringing a good word. In fact, they are bringing deceit and leading people astray. And then Paul especially hones in at the latter part of this chapter on his own resume, you could say, to commend himself to the church at Corinth. There were those false apostles who were probably claiming that Paul's suffering that he endured over and over again was actually a cause for him not to be considered to be an apostle, to be considered a false apostle, because he was suffering for his ministry, and this suffering disqualified him from the apostolic ministry. If he was truly an apostle, he would be blessed by God, wouldn't he? That's their argument. But in fact, Paul turns this around and he says, as a fool to foolish people. And he says first of all, he says his qualification, that he is a Hebrew, an Israelite, descendant of Abraham. But really what distinguishes him is the suffering that he endured. That's what is his mark of being a true apostle. And you see all that Paul endured here, the 39 lashes that he received 5 times, beaten with rods, stoned 3 times, shipwrecked, once stoned, 3 times shipwrecked, spent a day and a night in the sea, in the deep, dangers, robbers, labor and hardship, and all these different things. And of these things, this weakness is ultimately what leads to his strength, and what leads to his ultimately his defense of his apostleship. That's his mark of approval from Christ. Ironically, if you are a follower of Christ, you will suffer for him. That's Paul's argument, and I think that applies to us today as well. So 2 Corinthians 11. Again, we've talked about that one before, so if you want to go back and listen to the one from earlier in the year, you can do that as well. But I hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, September the 22nd, 2021.